which means that some of these people might also be acting in good faith. They might truly believe that what they're doing is good, is necessary to save the planet, is necessary for the environment. I mean, I don't think they're all acting in bad faith. The problem is that even if they're acting in good faith, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as we know. And nowadays we can say that, the road to disastrous outcomes, including environmental outcomes, is paved with green intentions. I'm Thomas Fazi. I'm a writer and journalist based in Rome. I write about a number of issues. I regularly write for two magazines, Unheard, which is a British magazine, and The Compact, which is an American magazine. And I've recently also produced a report on so-called carbon farming for the MCC Brussels think tank. And I guess that's what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, so full disclosure, we're both sort of visiting researchers at MCC, and we'll talk about that maybe a bit later. But could you tell me what is the situation that brought you to write this report? What's going on with farming and EU policy and all of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, unless you've been living under a rock for the past few months.
From quiet fields to busy city streets, farmers around the world have launched protests in recent weeks. They're demanding relief from what they say is a crisis. Ali Rogan reports on what's driving these protests and what it means for food supply and climate policies.
They come in convoys of tractors, armed with the fruits, bread, even the livestock of their labor. From Italy to India, farmers are taking to the streets, sometimes facing violence, sometimes causing it, protesting policies they say kill their livelihoods.
Agriculture has been on its knees for a long time, and we have reached the end of our rope.
In fact, farmers in dozens of countries on 6 continents have been staging protests since 2021. This year, most protests have been in European countries and India. The grievances vary by country, but there's one common message. Farmers can no longer bear the burden of economic and climate policies.
You will have noticed that farmers' protests have swept Europe. A kind of kicked off in Germany in December. But that kind of, really, really rapidly spread to many, many European countries. So now we're seeing very large and ongoing farmers' protests in countries like Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and several other countries. It's understandable why these protests have spread all over Europe, because even though in Germany the protests were triggered by a proposal, a decision by the German government, i.e. to scrap the diesel subsidies for farmers and to essentially raise taxes for farmers. Many of these policies aren't actually the brainchild of national governments. A lot of them are simply the drive for these policies is coming from the European Union, which is why we're seeing similar policies being rolled out all across Europe. So farmers across Europe have a common enemy, which is the European Union. And it's important to understand what's going on, because as usual, the mainstream media, the legacy media, hasn't done a very good job of explaining why these farmers are protesting. The general kind of gist seems to be that they're protesting for the right to continue polluting They just want to pollute. They're just dirty old farmers who just want to keep burning diesel and throwing pesticides into the soil. That's not what's going on at all. These farmers are literally fighting for their lives. We're at a crossroads in Europe where traditional farming, small and medium-sized farming, are really under threat of extinction, to the benefit of a completely different kind of farming model, which is the big agribusiness, industrial farming model, which is what the EU is pushing and has been pushing for a very long time. So this is what is at stake here. Farmers have felt for a very long time, small farmers especially have felt for a very long time that the system is rigged against them. And they're right. A lot of, farmers' incomes have been declining for a very, very long time. Farmers have been struggling to get by for a very, very long time as a result of essentially, what the rules of the game are. So, they've been subjected to all sorts of, for example, unfair trade practices, unfair free trade practices, whereby European farmers are subject to, increasingly restrictive regulations in terms of which in themselves, might even be considered positive when we think of, for example, labor rights, and so on, and even environmental regulations. The problem is that foreign producers that are part of free trade deals with the European Union are not subjected to these same regulations. So there you have a very clear example of an unfair trade practice that has, placed a lot of pressure on European farmers in recent years, in fact, decades. These are issues that farmers have been complaining about for a very, very long time. And now we're seeing a new wave of regulation that really risks being the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, or in this case, the farmer's back. Because and this is why we're seeing all these protests now. Why one may ask, why are farmers protesting now if these problems have been ongoing for a very long time? Because it really is the final straw. On top of all the problems that they've had to face in recent years due to these free trade practices, now they're also expected to essentially shoulder the so-called green transition, and what that means for a lot of farmers is going out of business. And the EU is quite, is even quite open about the fact that this is their, end game. They're openly saying that, the land that's currently used for, to grow crops, or for pasture has to be transformed into something else. Land that's used to essentially, store carbon.
Utopia by Thomas More, published in 1516. Page 21. What is that? Quoth the cardinal. Forsooth, my lord, quoth I, your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame, and so small eaters, now, as I hear say, be become so great devourers, and so wild, that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. They consume, destroy, and devour whole fields, houses, and cities. For look in what parts of the realm doth grow the finest and therefore dearest wool, where noblemen and gentlemen, yea, and certain abbots, holy men, no doubt, not contenting themselves with the yearly revenues and profits that were wont to grow to their forefathers and predecessors of their lands, nor being content that they live in rest and pleasure, nothing profiting, much annoying the weal public, leave no ground for tillage. They enclose all into pastures, they throw down houses, they pluck down towns, and leave nothing standing but only the church to be made a sheep house. And as though you lost no small quantity of ground by forests, chases, lands, and parks, those good holy men turn all dwelling places and all glebe land into desolation and wilderness. Therefore that one covetous and insatiable cormorant, and very plague of its native country, may compass about and enclose many thousand acres of ground together within one pale or hedge, the husbandmen by thrust out of their own, or else either by coven and fraud, or by violent oppression, they be put besides it, or by wrongs and injuries they be so wearied that they be compelled to sell all. By one means therefore, or by other, either by hook or crook, they must needs depart away.
And this, gets us to the issue that we're discussing today, so-called carbon farming. So the idea, of course, the basic idea, which international institutions have been discussing increasingly over the past few years. I mean, agriculture has for a long time was kind of left out of the whole climate mitigation policies. So if we look at the Kyoto Protocol and similar protocols, and the focus wasn't really on farming. It was mostly, of course, on industrial emissions, energy intensive industries, and so on and so forth. But that has kind of changed in recent years. We've seen a growing focus on agriculture as a climate as a climate problem, in the sense that agriculture is in fact one of the second largest emission greenhouse gas emitting sectors in the world, mostly in the form of non-CO2 emissions, so methane and things of that kind. And so it makes sense that in this kind of surging drive towards net zero, it was only a matter of time before net zero advocates started setting their eyes on agriculture. And so that's where we're at now. And the European Union is at the forefront of this paradigm shift, which essentially is all about now all the talk is how do we reduce agricultural emissions. So that's the big talk at the international level, not just in the EU. The problem is that there's not with current technologies, there's not many ways in which you can actually reduce emissions significantly in the agricultural sector without sacrificing output, basically. It's not like there are techniques available which can drastically cause emissions in agriculture to fall. There simply aren't. Which is why policymakers are increasingly kind of taking into consideration a much more drastic alternative, which is, well, if we can't reduce emissions from agricultural activities, then maybe we should start reducing agricultural activities altogether, which is essentially what carbon farming is all about. The idea is that land that's currently used for agriculture should be set aside and be transformed into what they call a carbon sink. And the idea is pretty straightforward. I mean, we know that soil and plants, just like the ocean, they capture carbon from the atmosphere, and they have the ability to store it for a very long time, essentially removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So in the drive towards net zero, it's not surprising that parallel to the drive to reducing emissions, we're also seeing an increased drive towards removing emissions. And in fact, we've also seen a growing interest in and growing research into so-called carbon capture and storing technologies, which are actual machines that would suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it. But we're very far off from developing any viable artificial carbon capture technology. So the alternative is the natural carbon storing, carbon capture and storing technologies, which is, as I said, alongside the ocean, the soil, and the plants. Hence the idea. Well, why don't we, go to farmers and tell them, look, your current job is too, you pollute too much, you produce too many greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to give you a new job. We're going to transform you into a land manager. So you're not going to grow food or crops anymore. You're not going to raise cattle or whatever anymore. You're simply going to, you use your land to grow grass or forests or whatever, and that's gonna be your new job. This is the idea behind carbon farming.
It seems quite logical. So why wouldn't it? So if you take these polluting lands and turn them into carbon sinks, surely that makes sense. So what's wrong with this policy? Why won't it work?
Well, there are a number of problems. First and foremost, the fact that we actually need the food that's produced by farmers. I'd say that's a very basic point. These are not expendable. It's not agriculture is not exactly an expendable sector. It's a sector which provides us the food that we need to survive. So this in itself means that it merits a completely different treatment from other sectors and other industries. So you have to ask yourself, when we're talking about literally reducing agricultural production and agricultural output, what are the potential consequences in terms of food security, in terms of food production, in terms of food prices? These are not, secondary questions. These are not secondary issues. And it's, by definition, carbon farming has an impact on agricultural output. And it does raise a very serious threat of food security. I mean, if you're putting potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of European small farmers out of business, that's going to have very serious repercussions, of course, on food production, on food prices. At a time when not just Europe, but the entire world is already facing serious problems of food inflation due to rising energy costs and falling production and disrupted supply chains and so on and so forth. So all the problems that we've been witnessing, first with the pandemic and then with the Ukraine war. So we know from countries that have more developed agricultural carbon markets than us. There aren't that many, but for example, countries like Australia and New Zealand have quite well developed agricultural carbon markets, and where we see people there are already raising the issue of the fact that hundreds of thousands of hectares of land that used to be used for growing food and raising cattle are now being bought up and transformed into forests. So that might be nice for the eye. Of course, who doesn't like lush green forests? But it becomes a problem when the end result is that you find yourself being able to produce less food, becoming more reliant on food imports, for example, which in themselves are very polluting. So because they have to travel halfway around the world to get to you. So you can already see that that there are a number of very problematic aspects with the idea itself of reducing agricultural land. Then there's another problem, and that's the fact that who these measures don't affect all farmers in the same way. They tend to affect small and medium-sized farmers much more than they affect big farmers, big agribusiness enterprises, because these carbon farming techniques are very costly. So they already exist. Different, various kind of private certification techniques. So you have private companies that you can call and say, hey, can you come and certify that, my land has become a carbon sink? Can you certify how much carbon I'm capturing and storing? There are already companies that do this, but these processes are very costly. They can run into the hundreds of thousands of euros over the course of just 5 years. So the costs are very very high and prohibitive, obviously, for small farmers. And then there's the question of all the administrative kind of technical burden that these policies require.
The dangers of carbon farming. An Unholy Alliance Between Finance and Environmentalism by Thomas Fazi, page 12. There are also powerful financial interests that stand to benefit from the expansion of carbon farming. Banks expect to rake in billions in trading revenues from the carbon offset market. The huge surge in carbon trading activity that is expected to come from increasing regulation will create many opportunities for financial institutions, as one industry report put it. Ultimately, it is these powerful corporations and financial institutions that are largely driving the EU's carbon removal agenda, and we can rest assured that they don't have the interests of small farmers in mind. It's important to acknowledge that, as it is, under the Common Agricultural Policy, small farms already face a high relative administrative burden. Many do not receive subsidies because of their small size. The result is that the distribution of CAP funds is highly concentrated. 20% of beneficiaries receive 80% of total farm income payments. The CAP and its subsidies per hectare have already led to an increase in farm size, greater concentration of land, and the disappearance of small and medium family farms across Europe. As one 2022 European Parliament report noted, over the years, structural change has led to a sharp decline in the number of farms, a consolidation of farmland, and an increase in average farm size. The EU's smallest farms have experienced the strongest decline compared to other farm sizes. This consolidation process, which sees the growth of the largest farms and their farmland, is occurring nearly all over the EU. Indeed, several studies show that Europe is not exempt from the global land-grabbing phenomenon. As one 2015 study, commissioned by the European Parliament's Committee on Agricultural and Rural Development, stated, there is significant, albeit partial, evidence that farmland grabbing is underway in the EU today, as measured by the degree of foreign ownership of land, the capturing of control over extended tracts of land, and the irregularities that have accompanied various land transactions. The report further noted that one of the features of this phenomenon has been the growing involvement in farmland acquisition of financial investors not traditionally involved in the agricultural sector, usually for purely speculative purposes, banking groups, investment funds, individual traders, and private equity companies. The report already acknowledged, almost a decade ago, that it is often precisely in the conversion of farmland from agricultural to non-agricultural use that the largest returns can be made, a practice termed land artificialization. One of the driving forces behind this trend has been the rise of energy crops, that is, crops grown solely for renewable bioenergy production, not for food, and the resulting economic revaluation of farmland, yet another unintended consequence of the EU's decarbonization agenda. This process has been called green grabbing, that is, instances where green credentials are called upon to justify appropriations of land.
So when you become what they call a land manager, this means that you have to implement the very, very sophisticated techniques, and to actually, because you got to quantify how much greenhouse gas emissions you are not emitting anymore, and then you have to quantify how much CO2 you're actually storing on your land. And this is the technologies required to do that are still in the, still in quite an infant stage. And in fact, also, even their reliability is questionable, and we can come to that. But the problem is that even assuming that these technologies are actually able to perfectly quantify how much carbon is stored on your land, which is debatable, this requires farmers or land managers to insert a huge number of data of inputs into these systems, and these are highly technocratic systems. So these are the burden, even simply the technical burdens that these that becoming a carbon farmer entails are very prohibitive for small farmers. So the most likely result of these policies, which we are already seeing, in fact, which is why these farmers are protesting, is that a lot of small farmers will essentially be bankrupt and be forced to exit. They'll be squeezed out of the market to the benefit of the big landowners and the big industrial farming enterprises. And here we have another paradox. In so far as we're presented, these are supposed to be green, sustainable policies, but the end result is that you end up destroying the small farming model, which tends to have a much smaller environmental and ecological footprint than big, hyper-industrialized farms. And various studies have also shown that on a per hectare basis, the small farms also have lower emissions than very large farms. So it seems somewhat paradoxical that in the drive to reduce emissions and to promote a more green, sustainable economy, you end up squeezing out of the market the small farmers, the medium farmers, that are the ones that in fact have the smallest environmental impact, as it is to the benefit of the large corporate farms.
So it seems like a basic case of regulatory capture. People often wonder, why do companies woke wash? Why do companies campaign for things that seem, leftist? And the answer is because they can afford to deal with the regulations, and they'll often push for really stringent regulations, knowing that their competitors can't keep up. Is that kind of what's happening here? Or is that too cynical a reading?
No, I don't think it is at all. I think that's definitely one part of the story. And in fact, I think it's no coincidence that we see that kind of big agro, as they call it. So the big agri-food corporate enterprises are very much in favor of carbon farming. Why is that? Because they care more about the environment than small farmers? That seems unlikely, considering that they're much bigger polluters. The reason is that, first of all, they know that they can shoulder costs. So if you are, a big agri-food corporation, you can definitely shoulder the extra costs. You can shoulder these, 100,000+ euros that are needed to implement these techniques, for example. That's not a big cost for you, while it's a huge cost for small farmers. And once you've done that, if you're if you own a lot of land, what these policies will create is a situation where the price of land will reevaluate. So these policies tend to increase the prices of land. So when you own a lot of land, you're just profiting from the fact that there are policies that make that push land prices up. And this goes also for financial speculators. This is a problem that we already see in Europe. So we've seen kind of non-productive sectors of the economy, such as finance, increasingly coming into the land owning business. So there's more and more land over the years in Europe has been bought by big financial corporations, big investment banks, because land is valuable in itself. It's a very valuable asset, and it becomes even more of an asset when essentially what these policies do is create a situation where land has value, for even when it has when no productive activities are done on it. So you can see the interest when you're a big landowner or even a big financial speculator in why, you can see why from their perspective, these policies might be in their interest. Number two, if you're a big agri-food company, you have an interest in, climate washing your activities. So from their perspective, the fact that, they're putting aside a bit of land and they can present this as, we're reducing our overall emissions by creating these carbon sinks, that from a PR perspective, especially these days, is very useful. And the same goes for non-agricultural industries who also have an interest in buying up as many carbon credits as possible. So what carbon farming means is that not only what EU and governments are telling farmers is, this is going to be very profitable for you because you're going to be able to then sell these carbon credits. So when you have a carbon sink, then you can, if you can quantify how much carbon you're storing, the idea is that you create, you can then emit credits, which others can buy. Who's interested in buying carbon credits? Well, big polluters. So if you're a big energy intensive industry, say, you're an oil company, and you, and in a number of countries, such as the EU, you have emission limits to respect, what are called cap and trade system or emissions trading systems. Which means that in order to, you have to offset your emissions, and you offset your emissions by buying carbon credits. So the more carbon credits are available, the better it is for you. It pushes the prices of those credits down, which means it's cheaper for you to buy carbon credits. And it also allows you to keep polluting by saying, look, I'm offsetting these emissions. So if all of a sudden, you have this surge of new agricultural carbon credits coming into the market, that's very beneficial for you, because then you can buy up these credits and say, okay, I don't need to change my industrial practices because I'm offsetting, I'm offsetting my emissions by buying all these carbon credits produced by these carbon sinks. So you can see why there are a number of sectors and actors in the economy that are interested in going in this direction. And of course, the end result will be greater concentration of farmland, greater, more so-called land grabbing, more financial speculators coming into the landowning business at the expense of small farmers. And this would happen in a context in which the EU, but this is a global phenomenon, but even the EU has not been exempt from this phenomenon of increased land concentration and land grabbing. As it is already, I think, I've actually got the exact numbers here. We already face a serious problem of land grabbing in Europe. So I think I'll give you the numbers. So these are actually from a few years back. And already, this was about 5 years ago, 3% of farms in the European Union control about 50% of the land, while 76% of farms control only 11% of the land. So land is already very, very concentrated in the EU as it is. We would, in fact, need to reverse that trend. We would need break up the big farms. We would have to redistribute land because what we want at the end of the day is to preserve the small family-run farming model that has been Europe's strength for so long. These policies go in the exact opposite direction. Carbon farming will only accelerate this trend towards growing concentration and kind of oligarchization of land and of farming. And so, of course, as you say, this raises the question of what is really driving, these policies. Um, and I think it's looking for a single overarching factor would be a mistake. I think because different actors have different interests first and foremost. So I think we should look at these policies as really the kind of policies that emerge at the intersection of power, class, technocracy, and ideology. So it's a mixture of all these things, and the European Union is a perfect example of this. You have a highly technocratized elite bureaucracy that is structurally apart from the real economy, from the everyday life of citizens, workers, producers, and is very prone to capture from whatever happens to be the current thing. And of course, the whole climate issue is the big current thing. And so, of course, they tend to be highly susceptible to capture to these ideas.
In part 2, we talk about how these policies do not actually cut emissions, and even if they did, would still be bad and even dangerous. Visit www.patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley.